You're marrying a man who owns nothing but the dust on his boots." Della Whitfield heard it from 3 separate mouths before the sun cleared the church steeple, and she gave each of them the same answer. She was marrying Jesse Calloway because she had chosen to, and no one in Prairie Hollow needed a better reason than that. She stood on the chapel steps in her mother's altered dress, the hem let out twice already to fit a woman 2 inches taller than the one it was sewn for, and watched the town gather like crows on a fence rail to see a fool make her worst decision in public. Jesse waited at the bottom of the steps in a coat too thin for the wind coming off the flats. Turned up at the collar, though it did little good. He did not own a horse. He did not own a house that could rightly be called finished. He owned a folded paper he kept sewn into the lining of that coat, close against his ribs, where a man keeps the one thing he cannot afford to lose, and he had told no one, not even her, what it said. By supper, half the county would call her a woman who had thrown herself away on a drifter. By winter, every one of them would be proven wrong. Though on that cold, bright morning, standing in a borrowed church with a man the town had already judged and dismissed, Della herself did not yet know how wrong. The arrangement had not begun with love, though it had not begun entirely without it either. Della's father had died in March. Quiet and sudden in his sleep, leaving behind a mortgage on land that had already been half sold off in a bad year to keep the family fed, and a stepmother, Mrs. Odessa Whitfield, who made it plain over cold breakfasts and colder silences that there was no place in that house for a grown daughter with no dowry left to speak of and no husband yet secured. Odessa had never been cruel in a way the neighbors could name. She was simply thorough in her arithmetic, and Della had never once balanced the sums in her favor. There had been an offer on the table before Jesse Calloway ever rode into town. Elias Puit, who ran the mercantile and had buried one wife already, twice Della's age and prosperous in the manner of a man who counted his prosperity daily and aloud. He looked at Della the way he looked at his ledgers, tallying what she would cost him against what she was worth to have, and he had given her 3 weeks to accept him or find another roof before winter closed the roads. Jesse Calloway rode into Prairie Hollow with little more than a bedroll, a rifle he never seemed to load, and the kind of quiet that made people nervous, because they could not read what was underneath it and assumed, as people do, that the worst explanation was the likeliest one. He took work where he found it that autumn, mending fence for the Hendersons, breaking a mare nobody else in the county would go near, hauling lumber for the new schoolhouse without once asking for more than the labor was worth. He kept to himself at the boarding house on Fig Street, spoke only when spoken to, and paid his bill on the first of every month without fail, though none of that seemed to count for as much in the town's reckoning as the fact that he owned nothing anyone could see. Della met him at the well behind the church, where she had gone one gray afternoon to be alone with the arithmetic of her own situation, and found him already there, filling a canteen with the unhurried patience of a man who had learned long ago not to rush toward anything, good or bad. She did not know, afterward, what had made her speak to him at all. Perhaps it was only that he did not look at her the way Elias Puit did, as though already totaling a bill. "You're the one they say has nothing." She had not meant to say it aloud, and color rose in her face the moment it left her. Jesse did not flinch, and he did not smile the practiced smile of a man trying to charm his way past an insult. He capped the canteen and set it on the well's stone rim before he answered. "I have a little more than they think, and a great deal less than they'd need to respect me for it." He looked at her plainly, the way a man looks at weather he intends to ride through rather than wait out on a porch. "What is it you need, Miss Whitfield?" Folks don't generally come out to a church well on a cold afternoon unless they're carrying something. She told him. Not all of it, not the particular shame of Odessa's cold breakfasts or the way Elias Puit's eyes moved over her like a man appraising stock, but enough. A roof that was not Elias Puit's roof. a way to keep her father's good name from becoming a debt some other man collected against her, one dinner at a time for the rest of her life. Jessie thought about it the way he seemed to think about everything, slowly, without performance, turning it over the way he might turn over a stone to see what lived beneath it. "I can't offer you comfort," he said finally. "I've a claim 11 miles out with one good wall to its name and a mule that doesn't much care for me yet. I can offer you a name that's yours to keep, and a promise I mean to keep it honest." He held out his hand, work scarred and steady, no ring on it, no polish to it at all. "It's not much of a bargain, Miss Whitfield." "It's an honest one," she said, and found she meant it. "That's more than I've been offered lately, from men with a great deal more to their name. They married within the month, in a ceremony so plain the Reverend nearly forgot the ring exchange and had to be reminded by his own wife from the second pew, and the town watched with the particular satisfaction of people who believe they have already read the last page of a story before the middle has even been written. The claim Jessie took her to was 11 miles out along a dry wagon road, a stretch of scrub and stubborn buffalo grass, with a cabin that had one good wall and 3 that argued daily with the prairie wind. He had filed on it the year before, 160 acres nobody else in the county had wanted, too dry-looking and too far from town to be worth the ride out for most men with better options. He worked it the way he seemed to work everything, without complaint and without hurry, and Della found herself doing the same within days, because there was a particular dignity in building something with her own hands that no clerk in Prairie Hollow could ever take a ledger to. The first weeks taught her the shape of him in small increments, the way you learn a river by wading it rather than by reading a map of it. He rose before light every morning and was always at the stove by the time she woke, not because he expected her to serve him, but because he seemed constitutionally unable to sit idle while there was coffee yet to be made and a day yet to be started. He never raised his voice, not once. Not even the morning the mule bolted clean through the new fence line and cost them the better part of a day's labor to repair. He mended her boot before she had even noticed the sole was coming loose, leaving it by the door with the thread stitched neat and small and entirely unremarked upon, as though it were nothing at all to notice a thing like that about a woman he had known only a matter of weeks. She began, without quite deciding to watch for the small proofs of him the way a person watches weather for the shape of the season to come. The way he stopped his work entirely when a hawk crossed the field, just to watch it climb, as though beauty still had the power to surprise him after whatever life he'd led before Prairie Hollow. The way he spoke to the mule in a low, even voice that seemed meant for no one else's ears. The way he never once, in all his quiet, made her feel like a bargain he had struck out of desperation rather than a woman he had genuinely chosen out of every woman a man in his position might have settled for. It was the well that told her the most, in the end, about the sort of mind he carried behind that quiet. 3 weeks into the marriage, the old well on the claim ran to mud, thick and useless, and every rancher for 10 miles around knew exactly what that meant heading into a dry summer with a young marriage and a half-mended house to keep afloat. Della watched Jessie walk the property for 2 full days without a word of complaint, reading the land the way other men read newspapers, pausing here and there to press his palm flat against the ground or study a stand of grass longer than seemed reasonable. On the 3rd morning he began digging 40 yards east of the failed well, in a low, unremarkable spot she would never in 100 years have chosen herself. The neighbors who rode past on the county road to see the fool waste his labor on empty ground did not stay long enough to watch him strike water 8 feet down, cold and sweet and steady, deeper and truer than the well that had failed them. "How did you know?" she asked him that evening, watching the new water run clear and cold into the trough, her hands still faintly trembling with relief she had not let herself feel until that moment. "I didn't know," Jesse said, wiping his hands on a rag, unhurried as ever. I read the ground. There was a stand of cottonwoods dying slow at that low spot, and cottonwood roots don't grow deep unless there's water feeding them from beneath. Something used to feed those roots and quit, which meant the water hadn't gone anywhere, only deeper. He looked out over the darkening field, not at her. Most men look at land and see what it's going to cost them. I was raised to look at it and see what it's already telling you, plain as speech, if you're willing to listen, instead of assume you already know better. She understood, watching him in the low gold light, that this was not luck, and it was not the idle skill of a wandering man with nothing better to occupy his hands. This was a man who had learned the world the hard way, in a manner that had left him quietly, thoroughly more capable than any of the polished men of Prairie Hollow. Whatever the town chose to believe about the coat on his back. There was a Sunday, not long after the well, when Della rode into Prairie Hollow alone to fetch flour and thread, and found herself standing at the counter beside two women from the sewing circle who had not troubled to lower their voices when she entered. They spoke of her marriage the way people speak of a house they expect to see condemned, with a kind of pity that pretended at kindness and was nothing of the sort. One of them, Mrs. Odom, remarked that a woman raised as well as Della had been deserved better than a man who could not even keep his own roof from leaking, and the other agreed, and neither looked at Della directly while they said it, which was its own particular cruelty. Della paid for her flour with a steady hand and did not answer them, because there was nothing in their arithmetic she could correct without sounding as though she were pleading her case, and she had resolved, riding out to the claim that first week, that she would never plead her case to Prairie Hollow. But she carried the sting of it home with her all the same. And Jesse, who read her the way he read the ground, noticed it before she had said a single word about it. Someone in town had something to say. It was not a question. It doesn't matter what they said. It matters to me. He set down the harness he'd been mending and came to stand near her, not touching her, only near. Not because I need to answer it, because I don't like the thought of you carrying something heavy 11 miles by yourself when you didn't have to. She told him, then all of it, the leaking roof and the pity and the two women who would not meet her eye, and Jesse listened the whole way through without once interrupting, which was, she was beginning to understand. Simply how he listened to anything that mattered. The roof will be finished by Friday, he said when she'd finished. Not because Mrs. Odom said a word about it, but because I told you a fourth wall was coming before the frost, and I mean to keep every promise I make you, whether or not a single soul in that town is watching to see if I do. He picked the harness back up, turning it over in his hands. Let them talk, Della. A man's worth was never decided by a sewing circle, and neither was a marriage. It was a small exchange, over almost as soon as it began, and yet Della found she carried it differently than she had carried the women's pity. She carried it like proof. Odessa Whitfield sent word out to the claim not long after, a short letter delivered by a boy on a borrowed pony, informing Della that she had heard talk of trouble at the mercantile and could not in good conscience offer her stepdaughter shelter should the claim ever be lost, given her own limited means and the obligations of her own household. There was no cruelty stated outright in it, only the same cold arithmetic Della had grown up reading in every letter her stepmother ever sent her, and she folded it small and tucked it beneath the flour tin rather than show it to Jesse, telling herself there were some burdens a wife ought to carry alone. Jesse found it 3 days later, reaching for the flour himself to start the morning bread, and read it standing at the counter with his back to her, quiet for longer than its short length should have required. You didn't think I ought to know this. I didn't want you carrying my family's coldness on top of everything else. He turned then, and there was nothing sharp in his face, only a kind of tired patience, as though he'd hoped, by now, she might have learned something different about him. Della, we agreed to build this life honest. That has to run both directions, or it isn't honesty at all. It's only a kindness one of us is doing for the other. He set the letter down, gentler than she'd expected. You don't have to protect me from your stepmother's arithmetic. I've been doing my own sums on this family a good while now, and they don't trouble me the way they trouble you. It was a small correction, quietly made, and Della carried it home into the following weeks the way she had begun carrying everything he said to her, turning it over like a stone to see what it was made of underneath. The pressure came, as it nearly always does, from the direction of Comfort's wounded pride. Elias Puit had not taken the marriage as final so much as an inconvenience yet to be corrected, and he began, in the manner of small men nursing large egos, to make the correction costly. He called in a debt against Della's father's account at the mercantile, one she had not known existed and could not disprove. Small enough to be believed by anyone who heard it, and large enough, all the same, to hurt a household with no cash to spare. He spoke of Jessie Calloway in the store, where the women of Prairie Hollow gathered on Thursdays to buy thread and trade gossip in roughly equal measure, calling him a man with no history worth trusting, a drifter who had likely married her for what little she still had rather than for anything so soft as feeling. And worse than any of it, he began quietly asking questions at the county land office, questions dressed up as idle curiosity that were nothing of the kind, about the Calloway claim and whether its filing would hold up to a closer look. Della came home from town one afternoon with her chin held high and her hands shaking the whole 11 miles back, and told Jessie everything over supper, because she had decided somewhere in those first weeks of marriage that she would not become a wife who managed her husband's feelings by managing what he was and wasn't allowed to know. He means to run us off this land, she said, setting down her fork. One way or another. If not through the debt, then by making the whole town believe you've no right to it at all. Jessie was quiet a long moment, standing at the window with the low evening light catching the gray already starting at his temples, though he was not yet 30 years old and had no business, by rights, looking so weathered. Let him ask his questions. His voice did not rise, not even slightly. I've nothing to hide from a land office, Della. I've something to hide from a town that's already decided a man's worth before he's opened his mouth to speak for himself. What is it you're hiding, Jessie? He turned from the window and looked at her then. Really looked. The way he had looked at her that first afternoon by the well. Sit down with me. It's past time I told you the truth of who I am, and I should have told you before I ever asked you to marry me, not after. He drew a folded paper from the lining of his coat, worn soft and pale along its creases from years of being carried close, and laid it on the table between them like a man setting down a hand of cards he had held too long, out of habit rather than any real strategy. It was a land deed, older than either of them, bearing his grandfather's name across the top and, beneath it, his father's, and beneath that, filed only 18 months prior in careful clerk's hand, his own, not the modest claim he had staked outside Prairie Hollow. Another parcel entirely. 3,000 acres of river-bottom grazing land 40 miles north, rich and green where this land was dry, with water rights that alone made it worth more than the whole of Prairie Hollow put together, 3 times over and more. It had been willed to him by a grandfather he had nursed alone through a long final illness, with no other kin left living to contest a single word of it. My family had land once, before my father drank it and himself both into the ground, Jessie said, his voice low and even, the way it always was, though something beneath it had gone tender in a way she had not heard before. I swore to myself, standing over his grave, that I'd never be a man who traded on what he was born to instead of what he'd earned with his own 2 hands. So, I left that riverland standing empty, and I came out here with nothing but a bedroll and a rifle I've never had cause to load, meaning to build something plain and honest before I'd let anyone hand me a name I hadn't earned all over again for myself." He met her eyes without a trace of apology in them. "I didn't tell the town, because I didn't want a single soul in it treating me one bit different for what my grandfather left me instead of what I'd made myself. And I didn't tell you, at first, because I wanted you to marry the man who dug your well." Della, not the deed, folded up in his coat. Della sat with the paper between her two hands, understanding all at once the particular quiet loneliness of a man who had chosen for a season to be underestimated by everyone around him rather than risk being loved for the wrong reason entirely. "You let them call you nothing," she said softly, "when a single word from you could have silenced every last one of them." "I let them," Jessie said, "because I wanted a wife who chose me before she ever knew what difference it might make to her comfort." His voice roughened, just slightly, the only crack in it she had heard yet. "You did choose me, Della. Whatever comes of this deed now, you already did that much, and nothing that follows changes it." The decisive moment came the following week, when Elias Puit rode out to the claim himself, flanked by a land agent brought all the way from the county seat, both of them prepared to contest the boundary lines and force a quiet sale through the very debt Puit himself had manufactured, confident to the last that a penniless drifter would have no paper worth answering him with. Jessie met them at the fence line, calm as a man discussing the weather over a fence post, and laid the deed flat for the agent to examine at his leisure. He watched Pruitt's face change color as the man read the name printed across the top of the page, and understood, in the space of a single indrawn breath, that he was not looking at a fool who had married beneath him after all. He was looking at a man who had chosen poverty for a season out of pure stubborn pride, and who could, with a single stroke of a pen, buy the mercantile and everything shelved inside it 3 times over without troubling his bank. "This changes nothing between us," Jessie said, and there was no triumph in his voice at all. Only a flat, final calm that carried further than shouting ever could have. "The debt against my wife's father's account will be paid in full by week's end, and you'll strike it from your books with your own hand, in front of witnesses if you'd like them. And from this day forward you'll speak of her, and of this house, with the plain respect both are owed, or you'll answer to me directly, in whatever manner you'd prefer to be answered." Pruitt left without another word, his land agent tipping his hat to Della on the way out, an apology dressed up as ordinary courtesy. That evening Jessie did not celebrate, and he did not gloat or make more of the moment than it rightly deserved. He simply walked the fence line one last time before full dark, the way he did every evening without fail, reading the ground the way other men might read scripture before bed, and Della understood, watching him from the porch, that this steady, unhurried habit was who he truly was, far more than any deed folded into a coat lining could ever be. He came to her afterward at the porch step, sat down beside her without a word of preamble, and took her hand in both of his. Work rough and steady as they had been that very first afternoon at the well behind the church. "I mean to send word north for the deed to be properly transferred into both our names, and to build something on that riverland worth the name my grandfather left behind him," he said, turning her hand over gently in his. "But I want you to know, Della, whatever we build up north, this claim stays ours too, exactly as it is. The well I dug with my own 2 hands. The fence I mended after the mule ran clean through it. The roof with 3 good walls now instead of 1, and a 4th coming before the frost sets in. That's the marriage I made with you. The rest of it is only money, finally catching up to what was already true between us before either of us knew what it would come to." Della thought of the church steps 3 months before, of the crows gathered on the fence rail and the frightened, arithmetic, weary woman she had been then, marrying a stranger to escape a worse fate she could see coming plainly down the road. And she thought of the woman sitting beside him now, on a porch step in the last good light of a long day. Beside a man the whole of Prairie Hollow had once called nothing at all, who had turned out to be a great deal more than any of them could have imagined, and no different at all, in the ways that mattered most, than the quiet man who had dug her a well and mended her boot without once being asked. "The town will have a great deal to say," she said at last, "once they learn the truth of what you are. Let them say it." Jessie turned her hand over once more, gently, and pressed his mouth to her palm, the closest he had ever come, in 3 months of marriage, to a spoken declaration of any kind. "I already know what I am to you, Della, and I already know what you were to me before you ever knew a thing about that deed. It's the only accounting I ever meant to keep." Above them, the last light was going gold and soft over land that was, at last and entirely, theirs to keep, and Della Calloway sat with her husband on a porch step that would one day be replaced by something finer, and never once wished it replaced any sooner than it came. It was enough, she thought, watching the water in the new well catch the last of the fading light, and hold it, steady and clear. It had always, from that very first cold afternoon at the church well, been enough.